Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we step into a world that feels hauntingly familiar in its humanity, yet remains distant in time. Perhaps you're listening as your thoughts begin to slow, or maybe you're already drifting with heavy eyelids. However you found your way here, I'm grateful. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from, and what hour graces your part of the world. The thought of this whispered story traveling across continents always brings a smile, a quiet reminder of how shared tales bind us. If these nightly walks through history bring you peace, don't forget to subscribe. Countless serene evenings await. Most of us think we know the story of the Salem Witch Trials. A handful of young girls accused townsfolk of witchcraft, hysteria spread, and unfortunate souls were executed before reason prevailed. It's often framed as a cautionary tale about superstition overpowering logic. But this sanitized version barely scratches the surface of what truly unfolded in Salem Village and beyond. The reality is far more unsettling, complex, and revealing about human nature than most realize. What erupted in Salem wasn't merely religious extremism or teenage cries for attention. It was a perfect storm. Social tensions, economic battles, personal vendettas, and psychological manipulation converged to create a killing machine fueled by fear and sanctioned by the institutions meant to shield the innocent. Today, we'll uncover why the Salem Witch Trials were darker than you imagined. We'll examine the cold precision of interrogation methods, how evidence was manufactured, and how the legal system itself became a weapon against the defenseless. We'll meet the real people behind the infamous names and see how their stories expose a community that had utterly lost its moral compass. But perhaps most chilling, the mechanisms that enabled Salem's horror aren't relics. The same psychological and social forces that turned neighbors into executioners still lurk beneath our civilized society today. The trials began in the winter of 1692, when 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, daughter and niece of Salem's minister, Samuel Parris, started suffering fits their doctor deemed supernatural. The girls screamed, contorted, and claimed spectral witches tormented them. But here's what's omitted. These weren't random outbursts. The girls had dabbled in folk magic, attempting to divine future husbands using egg whites and water. When their forbidden rituals went awry, fear of punishment drove them to reframe themselves as victims rather than admit guilt. Their calculated choice would cost 20 lives. The first accused were no accidents. Tituba, an enslaved Caribbean woman in the Paris household, had likely taught the girls magic. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, embodied the Puritan scorn for poverty. Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman, had scandalized Salem by living unmarried with a man and disputing her late husband's estate. Notice the pattern? The accusers targeted society's most vulnerable, those without power, allies, or means to fight back. When interrogated, the legal system morphed into a guilt factory. Magistrates John Hathorne and Jonathan Corwin entered examinations convinced of guilt. Their goal? Extract confessions and names, not truth. Leading questions, threats, and the girls' orchestrated fits made denial impossible. Confess, and you lived, but had to accuse others. Deny, and the girls' suffering proved your lies. Tituba grasped this while calculus best. Her confession wasn't just an admission. It wove a tapestry of devilish conspiracies, blood-signed pacts, and phantom accomplices. Her survival depended on feeding the court's hunger for validation. She learned a grim lesson. In this new order, truth was whatever the powerful needed it to be. The trials became a self-perpetuating nightmare. The girls' theatrics were treated as infallible evidence. Skeptics risked becoming suspects. Existing feuds over land, status, or church politics found lethal expression in accusations. The Putnam family, vocal trial supporters, had long clashed with many of the accused. Their 12-year-old daughter, and stood among the primary accusers. Her charges suspiciously aligned with adult grudges. Evidence grew absurd. Spectral visions only accusers could see, bodily marks dubbed devil signs, failed prayers interpreted as demonic interference. Even reciting scripture flawlessly could be twisted into proof of witchcraft. A flawless performance meant the devil was helping. The touch test epitomized the farce. If an accuser's fit ceased when the accused touched them, it confirmed guilt. The girls controlled the narrative entirely. Martha Corey's trial revealed the system's madness. When accusers claimed her specter blinded them from seeing her clothes, investigators found her calmly at home. Instead of doubting the accusation, the court decided she'd magically appeared in two places. A catch: 22, where innocence was impossible. This was Salem's true terror. Not belief in magic, but the deliberate warping of justice into a tool for persecution. The trials became a machine that converted suspicion into execution, fear into verdicts, and ordinary people into accomplices. Between February and September 1692, over 200 were accused, 20 executed, and more perished in squalid jails. The psychological torture began long before the gallows. Months in chains, families bankrupted by jail fees, and public executions designed to terrify. Yet many victims, like Rebecca Nurse, met death with dignity, exposing the moral rot of their persecutors. Salem's horror wasn't just the lives lost or methods used. It was how an entire community became complicit in state-sanctioned murder. How institutions meant to protect instead destroyed. How swiftly civilization crumbled when fear triumphed over reason. And the darkest truth? The forces that birthed Salem's nightmare. The weaponization of fear, the corruption of authority, the mob mentality, aren't confined to history. They live in us, waiting for the right conditions to awaken. But the psychological torment was merely the beginning. The so-called evidence used to condemn these accused witches reveals just how far Salem's legal system had spiraled into madness. Spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions, became the cornerstone of prosecution. Imagine this. Someone's nightmare about you could send you to the gallows. In Salem's twisted courts, fantasies were treated as facts, and the invisible was accepted as irrefutable proof. The judges, led by William Stoughton, didn't just tolerate this supernatural testimony, they encouraged it. They fostered an environment where the wildest accusations weren't just believed, but rewarded. Children who pointed fingers at neighbors were praised for their bravery. Adults who confessed to impossible crimes were spared, while those who maintained their innocence faced the noose. The system was rigged from the start, a grotesque theater where survival depended on playing along with the lie. One of the most disturbing aspects was how the trials became a macabre performance. The afflicted girls would writhe on the courtroom floor, shrieking that the accused were stabbing them with invisible pins. If the defendant so much as twitched a hand, the girls would mimic the movement, claiming the witch was forcing them to copy her. The crowd would gasp, the judges would nod gravely, as if they were witnessing divine justice rather than a rehearsed spectacle. But here's what makes this even more sinister. These performances were coordinated. The girls had learned that certain behaviors guaranteed the attention and protection of powerful men. They discovered they could destroy anyone, simply by pointing and screaming. And the adults who should have protected the innocent? They fed this monster instead. The speed of the executions was breathtaking. Bridget Bishop went from accusation to execution in just 2 months. Others had even less time. The court operated like a conveyor belt of death, processing cases with ruthless efficiency, prioritizing spectacle over justice. What's particularly chilling is how the accusations followed predictable patterns of prejudice. Women who defied Puritan ideals of submission were prime targets. Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, had the audacity to mutter under her breath when refused charity. Sarah Osborne had committed the unforgivable sin of living with a man before marriage. These weren't random charges. They were targeted character assassinations disguised as holy justice. The economic motives become undeniable when examining property seizures. When someone was accused of witchcraft, their assets were frozen. If executed, their land and wealth were forfeited to the state. Suddenly, neighbors embroiled in decades-long property disputes found a convenient way to eliminate rivals. The witch trials became the largest forced wealth transfer in colonial Massachusetts history. Take George Jacobs Sr., a wealthy farmer who had refused to hand over his land to certain family members. His own granddaughter accused him. Within months, Jacobs was dead, and his property was divided among those who testified against him. This wasn't justice. It was legalized theft, sanctified by hysteria. The authorities knew exactly what they were doing. Governor William Phipps initially supported the trials, until his own wife was accused. Suddenly, spectral evidence became unreliable. The moment the accusations reached the elite, the entire system collapsed. It wasn't morality that ended the trials. It was self-interest. The aftermath reveals the most damning truth. No reckoning ever came. When the hysteria faded, there was no thorough investigation, no accountability for the murders. Only collective amnesia, a desperate attempt to blame supernatural forces rather than human evil. Judge Samuel Sewell offered a half-hearted apology years later, but only when it was politically safe. Accuser and Putnam Jr. eventually claimed she'd been deluded by Satan, yet faced no consequences. The victims stayed dead. The guilty walked free. This pattern of deflection exposes Salem's darkest lesson. It wasn't about superstition. It was about a community's willingness to sacrifice the innocent to protect the guilty. It showed how quickly ordinary people can become executioners when fear overrides reason, and when institutions empower cruelty instead of restraining it. The Salem Witch Trials weren't an anomaly. They were a blueprint, a preview of how societies collapse when accusations replace evidence, when fear trumps fairness, and when the powerful realize they can manipulate panic for profit. The real horror of Salem isn't that it happened in 1692. It's that the same forces could, and do, still happen today. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Salem Witch Trials wasn't just the corrupted legal system or the fabricated evidence. It was how the accusations themselves became weapons in a silent social war, wielded by neighbors settling old scores under the guise of righteousness. The finger-pointing wasn't random chaos. It was strategic, calculated, and devastatingly precise. Take Martha Corey, a woman whose only crime was daring to question the trials. When the first accusations surfaced in 1692, Corey made the fatal mistake of suggesting the afflicted girls might be lying. For this act of skepticism, she was swiftly branded a witch herself. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. The accusers had stumbled upon the perfect system of control. Question the proceedings, and you'd find yourself in the dock within days. The community became hostage to its own paranoia, where speaking out meant risking everything. What made this system particularly cruel was how it weaponized Salem's existing fractures. The village was already split by generational land disputes, church power struggles, and economic rivalries. Families who'd feuded for decades suddenly had a legal way to annihilate their enemies. The Putnam family, among the trial's most vocal supporters, had been locked in bitter conflicts with several accused families. Their 12-year-old daughter became a lead accuser, and her charges suspiciously aligned with adult grievances swirling through their household. The geography of accusations tells its own damning story. Most accused lived on Salem Village's eastern side, while accusers clustered in the west, a divide mirroring years of political and economic tension. This wasn't coincidence. It was feudistry disguised as godly justice. But the trials didn't just settle property disputes. They enforced Puritan gender norms with terrifying efficiency. Women who stepped outside prescribed roles were prime targets. Bridget Bishop, the first executed, ran a tavern, wore colorful clothes, and had married 3 times. Her independence threatened the social order, and her execution sent a clear warning to others. Even pious Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother renowned for charity, wasn't spared. Her land dispute with the Putnams and her refusal to confess, despite a jury initially acquitting her, sealed her fate. When the court demanded a reconsideration, the verdict flipped to guilty. Nurse's hanging proved innocence itself had become a crime. The economic incentives turned the trials into a predatory marketplace. Accused witches' properties were seized, with sheriffs like George Corwin growing notorious for aggressive confiscations. Wealthy merchant Philip English fled to New York when accused, only to return to plundered warehouses and stolen ships. His case exposed how accusations could eliminate business rivals under the veneer of piety. Meanwhile, the afflicted girls, initially perhaps genuine victims of mass hysteria, evolved into something far darker. Their fits grew increasingly elaborate, collapsing when specific names were uttered, claiming spectral pinches left visible marks, or miraculously, reviving when touched by the accused. Their power was intoxicating. In a society where young women were meant to be silent, they now held life and death authority over adults. But maintaining this power required constant escalation. Each accusation needed to be more dramatic than the last. The girls found themselves trapped in a performative arms race. If they stopped, they'd be exposed as frauds. Some, like Mary Warren, tried recanting, only to be accused themselves and forced back into the charade. The court's interrogation techniques were psychological torture perfected. Magistrates like John Hathorne employed circular logic. If you're innocent, why do the girls suffer when you deny it? Defendants faced sleep deprivation, leading questions, and the unbearable pressure of knowing confession was their only survival path, even if it meant condemning others. Tituba's confession set the template. Admit guilt, spin tales of devil worship, and name accomplices. Those who refused, like Giles Corey, faced horrific ends. When 80-year-old Giles refused to plead, knowing a conviction would forfeit his land, judges ordered him crushed under stones. For 2 days, more weight was added until he died gasping. His final words a defiant more weight. His corpse ensured his heirs kept their inheritance. By summer 1692, Salem had become a place where friendship equaled conspiracy, where kindness was reinterpreted as witchcraft, and where over 200 accusations, 20 executions, and countless jail deaths later, the community had devoured itself. The trials collapsed only when accusations reached the elite, like Governor Phipps's wife, proving the system was never about justice, but power. The aftermath saw minimal accountability. Judge Samuel Sewell's belated apology came years later. Accuser and Putnam Jr.'s half-hearted confession arrived in 1706. Most participants simply moved on, leaving the dead uncompensated and the living to rebuild shattered trust. Salem's true horror lies in its revelation of how institutions designed for protection can so easily become tools of persecution. It showed how fear, when weaponized by authority, transforms neighbors into executioners, and how quickly civilization's veneer cracks under pressure. The mechanisms that enabled Salem, scapegoating, procedural corruption, the silencing of dissent, aren't relics. They reappear whenever societies prioritize panic over principle. The trials warn us that justice isn't self-sustaining. It requires constant vigilance against our own capacity for cruelty masked as righteousness. But perhaps the most insidious revelation of the Salem Witch Trials was how they methodically dismantled the very concept of justice, transforming courtrooms into theaters of predetermined guilt where the accused faced impossible choices at every turn. Picture yourself standing in that sweltering meeting house in 1692, the air thick with the stench of fear and the weight of hundreds of accusing eyes. You know with absolute certainty you're innocent. Yet as you scan the room, a horrifying realization dawns. This isn't a trial at all. It's an execution masquerading as legal procedure, a rigged game where the rules have been deliberately designed to ensure your destruction. The Salem Witch Trials represented one of the most complete perversions of justice in American history. Every safeguard meant to protect the innocent had been systematically corrupted or discarded entirely. The magistrates, men like William Stoughton and John Hathorne, weren't bumbling fools overwhelmed by superstition. They were educated, intelligent individuals who made conscious decisions to abandon every principle of fairness in service of their fanatical crusade. Their interrogation transcripts reveal chilling sophistication in psychological manipulation, demonstrating they knew exactly what they were doing as they twisted the law into a weapon. Let's begin with the most fundamental corruption, the reversal of the burden of proof. In any legitimate legal system, The accuser must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But in Salem, this principle was turned upside down with terrifying efficiency. The accused were forced to prove their innocence against charges that were impossible to disprove. How exactly does one prove they didn't send their spirit to torment someone in a dream? How do you demonstrate you never made a pact with the devil when no human witness was present? The court had created the perfect trap. Deny the charges and you're obstinate. Confess and you're damned. Remain silent and you're guilty. Sarah Good discovered this impossible standard firsthand during her examination. When Magistrate Hathorne demanded she explain why children were suffering if she wasn't afflicting them, her honest reply, "I employ nobody," was twisted into evidence. Hathorne's follow-up question, "Who do you employ then to do it?" revealed the circular logic. Any answer confirmed guilt. This wasn't justice. It was a sadistic word game where the rules changed mid-play to ensure the defendant's destruction. The evidentiary standards descended into outright farce. Spectral evidence, claims that someone's ghostly form had committed crimes while their physical body was elsewhere, became the cornerstone of prosecution. Imagine modern courts accepting dream journal entries as forensic proof. Yet in Salem, these unverifiable visions were treated as more credible than eyewitness testimony. The magistrates didn't just accept this nonsense. They actively encouraged it, asking accusers to describe their visions in vivid detail and then demanding the accused explain these supernatural allegations. During Bridget Bishop's trial, the proceedings reached new heights of absurdity when afflicted girls claimed Bishop's specter was pinching them. Instead of dismissing such claims, Magistrate Hathorne solemnly inquired, "Why do you seem to act witchcraft before us by the motion of your body?" When Bishop denied any wrongdoing, Hathorne pressed further. "Is it not your coat that hurts them? Your coat." They were seriously suggesting fabric could commit assault through magic, and treating this as legitimate legal argument. The accused were systematically denied basic defense rights. No legal counsel was provided. Cross-examination of accusers was prohibited. Hearsay was admissible. Even successfully reciting the Lord's Prayer, a standard test, could be used against you. If you stumbled, it proved demonic interference. If flawless, it showed the devil's help. The touch test was particularly grotesque. If an accuser's fit stopped when you touched them, it proved your guilt through supernatural means they alone controlled. Perhaps most sinister was how the court incentivized false confessions. In normal systems, confession ends the process. But in Salem, confession was just the beginning, a ticket to survival that came at the price of naming others. Those who confessed weren't executed, but pressured to implicate neighbors, family members, even children. Each new name kept the accusers safe while expanding the circle of suspicion. It was a pyramid scheme of accusation where survival required becoming complicit in the machine's hunger for fresh victims. Tituba's confession set this template in motion. Her elaborate tale of witch meetings and devil's books, clearly fabricated to satisfy her interrogators, provided the blueprint others followed. Meanwhile, those like Rebecca Nurse who maintained innocence faced the gallows. The message was unmistakable. Truth was irrelevant. The court wanted compliance, not facts. The psychological torture was methodical. Sleep deprivation, prolonged stress positions, threats against family members, all tools used to break the accused. Some were subjected to prayer tests, forced to recite scripture perfectly under duress. Any hesitation was deemed evidence of demonic obstruction. Others endured the witch's touch farce, where accusers controlled the outcome of a test no one could objectively fail. George Burroughs' case exposed the intellectual dishonesty at the system's core. The former minister was accused of leading all New England's witches despite scant evidence. When he perfectly recited the Lord's Prayer on the gallows, a feat Puritans believed impossible for witches, the crowd began doubting his guilt. But Cotton Mather swiftly reinterpreted this as further proof. The devil could transform himself into an angel of light. The system had reached peak absurdity. Any evidence could now be twisted to support guilt. By September 1692, Salem's legal system had become a self-validating death machine. Over 200 accused, 20 executed, several dead in jail, all in under 8 months. The speed was itself a weapon, preventing organized opposition while maintaining crisis momentum. Neighbors testified against neighbors, children against parents, wives against husbands. The social fabric unraveled as the community became both predator and prey in a nightmare of its own making. What makes Salem's legal corruption so terrifying isn't its medieval brutality, but its modern familiarity. The same tactics, presumption of guilt, unreliable evidence, coercive interrogation, appear in witch hunts throughout history. The trials stand as eternal warning. When society abandons justice's foundational principles, it doesn't slide into barbarism, it leaps. Yet beyond the corrupted courtrooms and orchestrated accusations lay the most disturbing truth of Salem. The trials didn't just punish individuals. They weaponized the very fabric of community against itself, transforming neighborly bonds into instruments of destruction. What began as isolated accusations soon metastasized into a social pandemic, where every interaction became potentially lethal and long-standing relationships turned toxic overnight. The psychological warfare waged in Salem's meeting houses and jail cells revealed humanity's terrifying capacity for collective betrayal when fear overrides conscience. Consider the case of Rebecca Nurse, a pious, elderly woman whose life should have been celebrated as a model of Puritan virtue. Her accusation laid bare how easily reputation could be shredded when mass hysteria took hold. Dozens of neighbors initially signed petitions defending her character, yet when the afflicted girls persisted in their claims, even Nurse's most steadfast supporters began questioning their own judgment. The court's acceptance of spectral evidence created an unwinnable paradox. How could one defend against accusations involving invisible forces only the victims could perceive? Nurse's eventual execution demonstrated Salem's new social order, where lifetime virtue mattered less than momentary accusations from disturbed children. The trials exploited pre-existing fractures in Salem's social structure with surgical precision. The Putnam and Nurse families' decades-long land dispute found perfect resolution through witchcraft allegations. Suddenly, complex legal battles could be won simply by having a teenage relative point a trembling finger during Sunday meeting. Economic tensions similarly found release through accusation. Wealthy landowner Philip English discovered his merchant success made him a target, with competitors eagerly testifying about his unnatural business acumen. When English and his wife fled to New York, their substantial property was promptly divided among their accusers, a pattern repeating throughout Essex County as the trials became New England's most effective wealth redistribution scheme. Gender dynamics played an equally sinister role. Of the 20 executed, 14 were women, most past childbearing age, many widowed or unmarried. These demographics weren't accidental. Women who fell outside male protection, whether through widowhood, inheritance, or independent temperament, became vulnerable targets. Bridget Bishop's tavern keeping and colorful dresses marked her as the first execution. Sarah Good's homelessness made her an easy scapegoat. Even Rebecca Nurse's respected position as a grandmother couldn't protect her once the accusations began. The trials reinforced patriarchal control by eliminating women who challenged, whether actively or simply by existing, Puritan gender norms. Children became unwitting weapons in this social warfare. The primary accusers, girls aged 9 to 20, found themselves wielding unprecedented power in a society that typically rendered them voiceless. Their fits and visions commanded adult attention. Their accusations could topple community pillars, and their performances in the meeting house became Salem's most compelling theater. Modern psychologists suggest some may have experienced conversion disorder, a condition where psychological stress manifests physically, but their symptoms suspiciously aligned with adult interests. When 12-year-old and Putnam Jr. accused Rebecca Nurse, she echoed property disputes her father had litigated for years. The line between genuine hysteria and coached performance blurred as the trials progressed, with the girls' accusations growing increasingly sophisticated and conveniently timed. The psychological pressure on the accused created impossible dilemmas. refused to confess and face execution, admit guilt and survive, but only by condemning others. This diabolical choice turned victims into accomplices, as seen in Tituba's elaborate confession. The enslaved woman's fantastical stories of red rats and flying witches weren't Caribbean folklore spilling out. They were survival strategies, crafted to give magistrates what they wanted while protecting herself. Those who resisted faced worse. Giles Corey's 2-day death under crushing stones resulted from his refusal to participate in the farce at all, denying the court even the pretense of legitimacy. Salem's ministers, who should have been voices of reason, instead fueled the flames. Cotton Mather's writings on invisible worlds and demonic pacts provided theological justification, while Samuel Parris's sermons portrayed Salem as besieged by satanic forces. When respected minister George Burroughs was accused, his ability to flawlessly recite the Lord's Prayer on the gallows nearly swayed the crowd, until Mather reinterpreted it as demonic deception. This theological doublespeak made the trials unstoppable. Any evidence of innocence could be reframed as proof of the devil's cunning. The economic machinery behind the trials reveals their true function as social control. Jailers charged prisoners for shackles and food. Sheriffs collected fees for each arrest. Magistrates received payments for examinations. Accusers sometimes directly inherited their victims' property, as with the Putnams acquiring nurse family lands. The system financially incentivized escalation. More accusations meant more fees, more confiscated property, more opportunities for enrichment. Salem's wealthiest families soon realized witchcraft charges could eliminate business rivals, resolve inheritance disputes, and consolidate power, all under the cloak of religious duty. As accusations reached the educated elite, the system began unraveling. When Governor Phipps's wife was named, spectral evidence suddenly became unreliable. The Massachusetts General Court dissolved the special tribunal, and over time, many participants expressed remorse, though few faced consequences. Judge Samuel Sewell's 1697 public confession stood as rare accountability, while most accusers, like and Putnam Jr., offered only vague claims of being deluded. The lack of meaningful reckoning allowed Salem's patterns to repeat throughout American history, from Red Scares to modern moral panics, whenever societies prioritize fear over fairness. The trial's aftermath proved as revealing as the events themselves. Families torn apart by accusations never fully reconciled. Properties seized through witchcraft charges remained contested for generations. The very word Salem became synonymous with injustice. Yet the most enduring legacy lies in the blueprint it created, a step-by-step guide for how communities can be manipulated into turning against their own members. The same tactics appear whenever leaders seek to consolidate power by identifying internal enemies, create undefinable crimes, lower evidentiary standards, reward accusers, punish skeptics, and above all, keep the fear fresh. Salem's true horror isn't that such events occurred in 1692, but that the social dynamics enabling them remain ever present. The witch trials demonstrate how easily neighbor can turn against neighbor when institutions encourage suspicion over solidarity. They remind us that civilization's veneer is thinner than we pretend, and that the distance between orderly society and collective madness may be measured in just a few panicked accusations. Yet the most harrowing dimension of the Salem witch trials was not merely the legal perversions or social betrayals. It was the psychological torture chamber they constructed, where every human instinct for self-preservation became a weapon turned against the accused. The trials didn't just execute bodies, they systematically dismantled minds, engineering impossible dilemmas where survival required moral compromise and resistance guaranteed destruction. This slow-motion annihilation of human dignity reveals the true depths of the tragedy, not as a historical anomaly, but as a case study in how systems can be designed to break the human spirit. Consider the diabolical genius of the confession system. In ordinary justice, confession provides closure. In Salem, it was merely the first turn of the screw. Those who admitted guilt weren't spared. They were forced to become active participants in the machinery of accusation. The court demanded names, details, elaborate stories of witch meetings, and devil pacts. Ketuba's initial confession set the template. Her vivid descriptions of red rats, flying witches, and a mysterious black man with a magic book didn't emerge from Caribbean folklore, but from the desperate creativity of someone realizing survival required feeding the court's hunger for supernatural narratives. Her confession wasn't believed, it was consumed, with magistrates pressing for ever more sensational details like addicts chasing a stronger high. The psychological pressure applied to extract these confessions was methodical and cruel. Prisoners were kept in freezing, feces-strewn jails for months, often chained in stressed positions that made sleep impossible. Interrogations lasted hours, with magistrates cycling through teams to wear down the accused. Some, like 80-year-old Giles Corey, chose torture over participation. His famous "more weight" as stones crushed his chest wasn't just defiance, but a calculated decision to preserve his family's inheritance from confiscation. Others broke differently. Margaret Jacobs first accused her grandfather and others, then retracted in a heart-wrenching letter admitting she rather chose to die with a quiet conscience than live with guilt. Her grandfather was hanged anyway. The afflicted girl's performances evolved into a grotesque art form. Their fits followed predictable patterns, collapsing when certain names were mentioned, recovering when touched by the witch, describing invisible specters with wardrobe details later verified by deputies sent to check the accused homes. The girls weren't passive hysterics. They were active performers who quickly learned their power. When Mary Warren attempted to recant, the others immediately accused her, demonstrating the system's ruthless self-preservation instinct. Their actions went beyond teenage attention-seeking. They were survival strategies in a society that had suddenly granted powerless girls the authority to condemn adults. The court's manipulation of religious belief added another layer of psychological torment. Puritan theology emphasized introspection for signs of God's grace or Satan's influence. The magistrates weaponized this, demanding the accused interpret their own suffering through spiritual frameworks. If you wept during interrogation, it revealed guilt. If calm, it showed the devil's influence. When Rebecca Nurse, a woman of renowned piety, was accused, her very virtue became evidence. Only a supremely skilled witch could have hidden her true nature so long. This theological judo turned Puritanism against itself, making faith a trap where any reaction confirmed guilt. Family bonds, the last refuge of the persecuted, were deliberately targeted. Children were encouraged to accuse parents, wives to testify against husbands. When Elizabeth Proctor was tried, the court demanded her husband John, himself imprisoned, testify against her. Their refusal to condemn each other only deepened suspicion. The message was clear. Loyalty itself had become suspect in Salem's new moral order. Even defenders weren't safe. When 39 neighbors signed a petition for Rebecca Nurse, several soon faced accusations themselves, teaching the community the dangers of solidarity. The economic pressures compounded the psychological torture. Accused families had to pay for their loved ones' imprisonment. 5 shillings per week for shackles, 3 pence per meal, even fees for the executioner's rope. Many were financially ruined before reaching trial. For the poor like Sarah Good, this meant complete destitution. For wealthier victims like Philip English, it allowed rivals to seize assets under legal pretext. The system didn't just punish the accused, it methodically stripped their families of every resource for resistance or recovery. Perhaps most devastating was how the trials corrupted language itself. Ordinary words became deadly, a muttered curse when denied charity, an offhand comment about bad luck. Even a poorly timed joke could be reinterpreted as supernatural threat. When Sarah Osborne joked that a sick child wasn't so bad as they made out, it became evidence of witchcraft. This linguistic poisoning meant no conversation was safe, no utterance couldn't be twisted. The trials didn't just kill people, they murdered trust in human communication. The aftermath revealed the lasting psychological scars. Some accusers, like Putnam Jr., later expressed remorse, but most participants simply retreated into silence. Families of the executed faced generations of stigma. Descendants of Rebecca Nurse reported being called witch's spawn well into the 19th century. The trauma reshaped community dynamics permanently. Salem Village ultimately seceded from Salem Town, partly due to lingering tensions from the trials. Modern psychology recognizes Salem as a textbook case of institutional gaslighting, a system where reality itself was defined by those in power, where resistance only proved your guilt deeper. The trials created what psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton called a totalism environment, a closed system where all information confirms the system's validity, and dissent is impossible because the language to express it has been corrupted. The true horror of Salem's psychological warfare isn't that it happened in 1692, but how familiar its tactics feel today. The weaponization of language, the exploitation of trauma for social control, the systematic dismantling of trust. These aren't relics of Puritan New England. They're tools still wielded whenever societies prioritize conformity over truth, whenever institutions value self-preservation over justice. Salem teaches us that the most effective witch hunts don't burn victims at the stake. They force them to light the pyres themselves. What made the Salem Witch Trials uniquely terrifying wasn't just the executions or false accusations. It was how ordinary people became willing executioners, their moral compasses systematically rewired to see cruelty as virtue. The trials didn't emerge fully formed. They were carefully cultivated through psychological conditioning that transformed a quiet Puritan village into a factory of human suffering. This process of mass moral corruption holds urgent lessons about how easily civilized societies can descend into barbarism when certain social levers are pulled. The conditioning began long before the first accusation. Puritan ministers like Cotton Mather had spent years preparing the psychological soil, delivering sermons depicting New England as a battleground between God's elect and Satan's minions. Their rhetoric created what psychologists now call apocalyptic thinking, a worldview where everyday misfortunes became signs of cosmic warfare. When a cow died or a child fell ill, the explanation shifted from bad luck to demonic assault. This framing made witchcraft accusations inevitable, not because magic was real, but because the community had been trained to interpret misfortune as supernatural attack. The afflicted girl's early symptoms should have been warning signs, not proof. Their convulsions, pinching sensations, and temporary blindness match modern understandings of conversion disorder, where psychological distress manifests physically. But instead of medical care, they received something far more dangerous: absolute authority. When adults validated their symptoms as supernatural evidence, the girls discovered a power they'd never known in their strictly controlled lives. Their performances escalated not just from malice, but from the intoxicating realization that for the first time, adult men, judges, ministers, fathers, hung on their every word. The court proceedings became ritualized indoctrination sessions for the entire community. Each trial followed the same pattern. The accused would enter to the girl's dramatic collapse. Magistrates would interpret random gestures as spectral evidence, and spectators would leave more convinced of the witch threat. Like a twisted catechism, this repetition rewired neural pathways. The more often people witnessed these proofs, the more real they felt. Neuroscientists now recognize this as the illusory truth effect, where repeated exposure to falsehoods increases belief. Social pressures compounded the psychological manipulation. As accusations mounted, conformity became a survival strategy. To doubt the trials wasn't just dangerous, it marked you as morally suspect. When respected figures like Minister George Burroughs were accused, it demonstrated no one was safe. The community split into two groups: believers who embraced the witch narrative and gained protection, and sympathizers who questioned it, risking accusation. This binary eliminated middle ground. You were either with the court or potentially with the witches. Economic incentives further distorted moral judgment. The trials created a perverse marketplace where accusations became currency. Informants could settle debts by testifying against creditors. Neighbors could gain land by accusing owners. Sheriffs grew wealthy from prisoner fees. This commercialization of persecution created what economist Timur Kuran calls preference falsification, where people publicly support actions they privately oppose because the system rewards compliance. Many who signed accusations likely disbelieved them, but saw no alternative in a system where silence equaled complicity. The most devastating conditioning targeted children. Young accusers like 12-year-old and Putnam Jr. weren't born monsters. They were molded through trauma and manipulation. Modern analysis of Putnam's later apology suggests she exhibited classic symptoms of coerced confession, internalizing guilt for actions she'd been pressured to perform. The girls didn't just accuse. They were taught to perform their accusations in court-approved ways, their testimony shaped by leading questions from magistrates who already knew the truth. This systematic moral corruption helps explain the trial's most puzzling aspect: how otherwise decent people participated willingly. The answer lies in what psychologist Stanley Milgram later demonstrated. Ordinary people will commit atrocities when authority figures assume responsibility. Salem's judges and ministers served this role, assuring accusers that God approved their actions. Like Milgram's subjects who continued shocking victims because a scientist in a lab coat said to continue, Salem's residents could torture neighbors because men in black robes said it was holy. The aftermath revealed how deeply the conditioning ran. When the trials ended, few could admit they'd been wrong. The cognitive dissonance was too great. Instead, most retreated into what psychologist Leon Festinger called effort justification, convincing themselves the suffering had been necessary to root out evil. This explains the half-hearted apologies and minimal restitution. Acknowledging the full truth would have shattered their self-conception as moral people. Modern parallels are chilling. From McCarthyism to genocidal propaganda, the same conditioning patterns reappear whenever societies dehumanize subgroups. The real horror isn't that Salem happened in 1692. It's that its psychological blueprint remains distressingly effective. Social media algorithms now perform the minister's role, reinforcing apocalyptic thinking. Cancel culture mirrors the binary of believers versus sympathizers. And everywhere, people still obey authorities telling them cruelty is justice. Salem's deepest lesson isn't about witchcraft. It's about how easily human morality can be hacked when fear, authority, and social reward align. The trials show that evil doesn't require evil people, just ordinary people conditioned to see evil as good. This is why we must study Salem not as ancient history, but as a warning etched in the fragile fabric of our shared humanity. The witch trials didn't end in 1693, they simply evolved. The Salem Witch Trials represent one of history's most disturbing case studies in institutional failure, not because the system broke down, but because it worked exactly as designed. What appears at first glance as mass hysteria was in fact a meticulously engineered social catastrophe, where every pillar of civilization, religion, law, medicine, and community was systematically perverted to serve the machinery of persecution. This institutional collusion reveals how thin the veneer of civilization truly is when powerful groups find persecution politically useful. The religious establishment's role was particularly insidious. Puritan ministers like Cotton Mather didn't merely tolerate the trials, they actively shaped their theological justification. Mather's 1689 treatise, Memorable Providences, had essentially written the playbook, detailing supposed signs of witchcraft that later appeared suspiciously often in Salem accusations. When the trials began, ministers performed critical psychological functions. They reassured accusers of their moral purity, framed skepticism as spiritual weakness, and most crucially, provided an escape valve for cognitive dissonance through the concept of Satan's cunning. This theological loophole allowed any contradictory evidence to be dismissed as the devil's deception, creating a closed logic system immune to factual rebuttal. The medical community's failure was equally glaring. Physicians like William Griggs, who diagnosed the afflicted girls with evil hand, witchcraft weren't backward country doctors. They were Harvard-educated men familiar with European medical texts. Their willingness to attribute physical symptoms to supernatural causes reflected not ignorance, but calculated careerism. In a society where ministers held ultimate authority, diagnosing witchcraft rather than medical conditions was the safer professional choice. This betrayal of Hippocratic ideals created a public health crisis where mental illness became criminalized and physical suffering was seen as spiritual evidence rather than requiring treatment. The legal system's corruption followed a predictable pattern seen in all show trials throughout history. Magistrate John Hathorne, ancestor of novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne, employed interrogation techniques still used in modern false confessions: sleep deprivation, leading questions, and the prisoner's dilemma tactic of offering leniency for naming accomplices. The court's procedural innovations, like accepting spectral evidence and denying defense counsel, weren't accidents but deliberate choices to streamline convictions. Records show magistrates frequently coached accusers, with one deponent recalling Hathorne instructing a girl, "Did Goody Proctor pinch you? Look, now she sucks her fingers." Economic institutions formed the trial's hidden engine. The colony's 1691 charter had created land scarcity by requiring property ownership for voting rights, intensifying competition. Accusations frequently targeted wealthy families like the Porters, whose extensive holdings were coveted. The system monetized persecution at every level. Jailers charged prisoners for shackles, 7 shillings per set, and even air, 2 shillings weekly to open cell windows. Sheriff George Corwin became notorious for seizing victims' property. When Philip English fled, Corwin looted his mansion down to the silverware. These financial incentives ensured the system's self-perpetuation, as each conviction funded further persecutions. Educational institutions reinforced the madness. Puritan schools taught children to scrutinize every misfortune for divine meaning, creating generations primed for supernatural explanations. The dame schools, run by women like accused witch Sarah Good, ironically helped create the very accusers who would later testify against them. This education produced what psychologists call magical thinking, the tendency to see connections between unrelated events, which made spectral claims plausible to otherwise rational people. The press played its part in spreading terror. While no newspapers existed in 1690s Massachusetts, ministers' sermons and published accounts like Mather's Wonders of the Invisible World served similar functions. These texts didn't merely report events. They actively shaped perceptions through loaded language. Descriptions of accused witches as hellish harpies and devil's brood dehumanized targets before trials even began, while accounts of afflictions were exaggerated with each retelling. This early form of media sensationalism created feedback loops where the most outrageous claims received the most attention and imitation. Family structures were weaponized. The traditional Puritan household, with its strict patriarchal hierarchy, became an enforcement mechanism. Fathers pressured daughters to accuse, husbands testified against wives, and children were encouraged to betray parents. The case of Abigail Hobbs exemplifies this. After confessing to witchcraft, she was forced to accuse her own father. These broken family bonds didn't just supply accusations, they destroyed potential support networks that might have resisted the trials. The institutional failures converged most dangerously in the treatment of dissent. When respected merchant Thomas Maule publicly questioned the trials, he was immediately jailed for slanderous speech, a warning to others. Minister Francis Dane's cautious objections only gained traction when the accusers targeted his daughter and granddaughter. This selective suppression created the illusion of consensus while silencing opposition through carefully calibrated terror. What makes Salem's institutional collapse so relevant is its familiarity. The same patterns reappear whenever societies abandon their protective functions. Religious leaders justifying persecution, medical professionals certifying state narratives, lawyers perverting due process, and economic systems profiting from human misery. From the Stalinist purges to the McCarthy era, the institutional playbook remains remarkably consistent. The trials finally ended not because institutions regained integrity, but because the persecution began threatening their own interests. When accusations reached Governor Phipps's wife, the same ministers who had championed spectral evidence suddenly discovered its unreliability. The about-face wasn't principled, it was pragmatic. This final betrayal revealed the trial's true nature. Not a holy war against Satan, but a tool for maintaining power that was discarded when it endangered the powerful. Salem's institutions didn't fail to stop the witch trials. They succeeded in exactly what they were designed to do: protect elite interests while creating the illusion of legitimate process. This is the enduring warning. When law, religion, medicine, and media align behind persecution rather than protection, no individual, no matter how innocent, stands a chance. The horror isn't that the system failed, but that it worked exactly as designed. The psychological legacy of the Salem Witch Trials extends far beyond the gallows and jail cells of 1692. It represents a terrifying case study in how ordinary people can be systematically manipulated into committing extraordinary acts of cruelty. What began as isolated accusations metastasized into a full-blown moral pandemic through carefully engineered social conditioning that transformed neighborly compassion into lethal suspicion. The trials didn't just execute individuals. They methodically rewired an entire community's moral operating system, demonstrating how quickly civilized norms can collapse when specific psychological triggers are activated. At the heart of this transformation was what modern psychologists term moral disengagement, the cognitive process by which people convince themselves ethical standards don't apply to their conduct. The Salem magistrates achieved this through 8 identifiable psychological mechanisms that remain alarmingly relevant today. First came the dehumanization process. Accused witches were systematically stripped of their humanity in court transcripts and sermons, referred to as hellish fiends and Satan's brood, rather than as mothers, farmers, or midwives. This linguistic distancing made their suffering abstract, allowing otherwise compassionate Puritans to ignore the anguished cries of women they'd known for decades. Modern parallels appear in genocidal rhetoric where victims are reduced to vermin or cockroaches. The court then employed what psychologist Albert Bandura calls advantageous comparison. By framing executions as holy acts protecting the community from supernatural terror, hanging an elderly woman like Rebecca Nurse could be reinterpreted as morally superior to allowing potential witchcraft to spread. This same justification appears today when governments defend torture as enhanced interrogation for national security. Diffusion of responsibility was carefully cultivated. Magistrates assured accusers that God and the court bore ultimate accountability for verdicts. This psychological buffer allowed individuals to participate while denying personal culpability, a dynamic chillingly replicated in Nazi bureaucrats who claimed they just followed orders. Records show even executioner George Corwin justified his role by claiming he merely fulfilled his office. The gradual escalation of violence followed a well-documented psychological pattern. What began with spectral accusations progressed to arrests, then torture, then executions, each step normalizing greater brutality. By the time the first hanging occurred, the community had been incrementally desensitized through months of escalating rhetoric and procedural violence. Modern psychological studies from the Stanford prison experiment to Abu Ghraib confirm how quickly ordinary people adapt to escalating cruelty when authority figures sanction it. Moral justification was reinforced through religious framing. Each hanging wasn't murder, but purification. Each confiscated farm not theft, but God's justice. This spiritual veneer transformed persecution into virtue, allowing participants to maintain self-image as righteous people. Similar mechanisms appear today when suicide bombers believe they're martyrs, or when cyberbullies claim they're just telling the truth. The distortion of consequences was particularly insidious. When 71-year-old Rebecca Nurse was hanged, the court framed it not as killing a grandmother, but as freeing her soul from Satan's grasp. This cognitive reframing prevented participants from confronting the human cost of their actions. Modern corporations use similar tactics when describing layoffs as right-sizing, or pollution as externalities. Attribution of blame to victims completed the psychological trap. If an accused witch like Sarah Good protested her innocence, it proved the devil was speaking through her. If she confessed, it validated the court's authority. This catch-22 eliminated all pathways for the accused to demonstrate innocence, a tactic later seen in McCarthy-era hearings where any defense was taken as evidence of communist sympathies. Finally, the system employed what psychologist Irving Janis termed groupthink, the suppression of dissent to maintain the illusion of unanimity. When Merchant Thomas Mall questioned the trials, his imprisonment sent a clear message. The few who spoke out, like Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall who resigned in protest, were ostracized. This created a false consensus where the majority's silence was misinterpreted as agreement, accelerating the dissent into collective madness. The afflicted girl's psychology reveals another disturbing layer. Modern analysis suggests many exhibited conversion disorder, where psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms. But their behavior also shows signs of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a condition where caregivers exaggerate or induce illness and dependence for attention. The girls discovered their fits granted unprecedented power in a society that otherwise rendered them voiceless. Their escalating accusations, from marginalized women like Tituba to respected figures like Rebecca Nurse, demonstrate how intoxicating this power became. The community's collective trauma response followed patterns seen in modern disaster psychology. The initial heroic phase saw neighbors banding together against the perceived witch threat. This progressed to the honeymoon phase, where the trials provided simple explanations for complex misfortunes. Finally came the disillusionment phase, when the scale of executions forced recognition of their complicity. The delayed trauma explains why so many participants, like Accuser and Putnam Jr., later recanted only after the crisis passed. Neurobiological factors likely contributed to the hysteria. Some historians hypothesize ergot poisoning from moldy rye bread, which causes hallucinations matching some affliction descriptions, though this theory remains debated. More certain is the role of sleep deprivation. Many accusers exhibited symptoms matching modern diagnoses of psychotic breakdowns from prolonged stress and lack of sleep. The trial's aftermath reveals the lasting psychological scars. Many participants developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Descendants of the accused reported family shame persisting for generations. The community's collective coping mechanism to suppress memory of the events created what psychologist Robert J. Lifton calls psychic numbing, where societies repress traumatic history rather than confront it. Modern parallels abound. From McCarthyism to social media witch hunts, the same psychological mechanisms reappear whenever groups seek scapegoats for complex problems. The military's enhanced interrogation programs employed similar moral disengagement tactics. Even corporate cultures can mirror Salem's dynamics when whistleblowers are treated like modern witches. What makes Salem uniquely terrifying isn't that such psychological manipulation occurred in 1692, but that we now recognize it as a replicable playbook. The 8 mechanisms of moral disengagement don't require Puritan theology. They can be activated by any authority structure that provides sufficient justification, gradual escalation, and social reinforcement. The trial's ultimate lesson is neither about witchcraft nor Puritanism, but about universal human vulnerability. They prove our moral compasses aren't fixed, but adjustable, capable of being recalibrated to justify almost any action given the right psychological conditioning. This isn't ancient history. It's a warning written in the neural pathways we all share. In an age of algorithmic radicalization and viral misinformation, Salem's psychological pandemic feels less like distant history than like a mirror reflecting our own capacity for collective delusion. The true horror isn't that Salem happened, but that, given the right conditions, it could happen again anywhere. Not with witches and gallows perhaps, but through whatever new forms of moral panic our era invents to justify its own cruelties. The Salem Witch Trials did not occur in a historical vacuum. They emerged from a perfect storm of social, economic, and political tensions that transformed a localized conflict into a lethal epidemic of mass delusion. To understand how an entire community could descend into such madness, we must examine the volatile cocktail of circumstances that made Salem Village in 1692 a tinderbox waiting for a spark. This contextual analysis reveals how ordinary grievances, when amplified by structural instability, can metastasize into extraordinary violence, a pattern repeating throughout human history whenever similar conditions align. At the most fundamental level, Salem was a community under siege, both literally and psychologically. The Massachusetts Bay Colony existed in a perpetual state of anxiety following King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, where Native American attacks had devastated frontier settlements. Survivors like Mercy Lewis, who witnessed her parents slaughtered in the Maine wilderness, carried untreated trauma into Salem's social fabric. These wartime experiences primed the community to interpret misfortune through a lens of existential threat, where every crop failure or illness felt like another assault on their fragile civilization. The political landscape further destabilized the region. The 1684 revocation of Massachusetts' original charter created a constitutional crisis, and the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England sparked colonial power struggles. When Governor Edmund Andros was overthrown in 1689, Massachusetts spent 3 years in legal limbo until the 1691 charter arrived, precisely as the witch trials began. This political instability left local authorities desperate to assert control, making the witch trials an inadvertent tool for restoring order through scapegoating. Economic factors proved equally combustible. Salem Village, present-day Danvers, had long chafed under Salem town's economic dominance. The village's subsistence farmers struggled while the town's merchant elite grew wealthy through Atlantic trade. A bitter dispute over the village's independent ministry, with the Putnams supporting Reverend Samuel Parris and the Porters opposing him, became a proxy war between these factions. Tituba's folk magic stories, introduced into this tinderbox, provided the supernatural framework that transformed economic resentment into demonological panic. Climate science now reveals another crucial factor: the Little Ice Age's extreme weather. Tree ring data shows 1692 followed some of the coldest winters in centuries, with crop failures across New England. Puritan theology interpreted such disasters as divine punishment, intensifying the search for scapegoats. The same climate anxiety appears in European witch trials during the 1580s and 1630s, other periods of extreme cooling. Demographic pressures compounded the crisis. Salem's population had quadrupled since founding, creating land scarcity that pitted generations against each other. Older families like the Porters held large estates, while younger Putnams saw witchcraft accusations as tools to break this economic stranglehold. The average age of accusers was 16.5 years, teenagers with no inheritance prospects in a society where 80% of property went to firstborn sons. Their accusations often targeted propertied women past childbearing age, eliminating competitors for scarce resources. Religious developments heightened the tension. The Puritan experiment was faltering by 1690, with younger generations less devout than their parents. Ministers like Cotton Mather responded by emphasizing Satan's imminent threat, a narrative that required visible enemies to sustain its urgency. The witch trials became performative theater, proving this cosmic war's reality, with each execution serving as ritual purification for the community's spiritual doubts. Medical ignorance played its part. The afflicted girl's symptoms, convulsions, hallucinations, skin sensations, match modern diagnoses of epilepsy, Lyme disease, or even mass psychogenic illness. But Puritan medicine attributed such phenomena to supernatural causes. Physician William Grigg's diagnosis of evil hand, witchcraft, wasn't mere superstition. It reflected standard European medical texts that still cited demonic possession as legitimate pathology. The legal system's structure incentivized accusations. English law awarded accusers a portion of convicted witches' property, a bounty system guaranteeing accusations would proliferate once initiated. Combined with Puritan inheritance practices that concentrated wealth among eldest sons, this created explosive pressure for younger siblings and landless families to make witchcraft claims against propertied neighbors. Communication technology of the era amplified the panic. While no newspapers existed, sermons and handwritten relations circulated rapidly through Puritan society's dense interpersonal networks. Cotton Mather's 1689 account of Boston, which Mercy Short spread Salem's affliction template across New England. This viral transmission of narrative prototypes helps explain why outbreaks occurred simultaneously in multiple towns, not through conspiracy, but shared cultural scripting. The Native American threat resurfaced psychologically. Many accusers like Mercy Lewis were refugees from frontier wars, their trauma sublimated into witchcraft fears. Tituba's Caribbean background allowed Puritans to project both indigenous and African otherness onto her, a double-layered exoticism that made her perfect scapegoat. When the girls described the black man, of which lore, they likely drew on fears of both Satan and the Wabanaki warriors who had burned their homes. Salem's geography intensified the crisis. The village's isolation, a day's ride from Boston, created an echo chamber where rumors amplified unchecked. Unlike European witch trials that often involved outside investigators, Salem's magistrates were local men embedded in the same social networks as accusers and accused. This lack of detachment turned the legal process into an extension of village politics by other means. The timing of events followed a psychological cascade. The initial February accusations targeted social outliers, Tituba, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, allowing the community to test the accusation process with low-risk targets. By May, accusations moved inward to church members like Martha Corey, demonstrating the expanding circle of suspicion. By summer, even the governor's wife was implicated, the moment elite self-preservation instincts finally stopped the machinery. Modern comparisons are illuminating. The 1980s satanic panic saw nearly identical accusation patterns emerge from daycare centers to courtrooms. The 2003 Iraq WMD frenzy followed similar groupthink dynamics among policymakers. Social media witch hunts today replicate Salem's viral accusation spirals, just digitally accelerated. What makes Salem uniquely instructive is how it demonstrates the predictable progression from structural instability to collective violence. The same ingredients, existential anxiety, political uncertainty, economic stress, climate disruption, medical ignorance, and legal incentives, appear in virtually all mass persecution events throughout history. The trials didn't end because people regained sanity, but because the accusation spiral finally threatened the powerful. When Governor Phipps's wife was named, spectral evidence suddenly became unreliable, revealing the entire system as politically malleable rather than divinely inspired. This pattern, where persecution continues until it inconveniences elites, repeats through history from the Spanish Inquisition to McCarthyism. Salem's ultimate lesson isn't about witchcraft, but about how societies under stress manufacture enemies to explain their suffering. The same psychological mechanisms that turned a few sick girls into witch accusers now drive everything from conspiracy theories to political extremism. In an age of climate change, pandemics, and social fragmentation, understanding Salem's contextual triggers becomes not just academic, but a survival skill for recognizing when our own society starts mirroring 1692's descent into collective nightmare. The Salem Witch Trials did not conclude with the last hanging in September 1692. Their psychological and social aftershocks reverberated through generations, leaving scars that reshaped our understanding of historical trauma's long-term consequences. What began as a localized panic metastasized into a cultural wound that took centuries to heal, with patterns of silence, shame, and suppressed guilt manifesting in ways modern psychology now recognizes as classic trauma responses. The post-trial period reveals not just a community's attempt to move past horror, but a case study in how societies process collective guilt when the scale of wrongdoing defies easy reconciliation. In the immediate aftermath, the mechanics of denial swung into action with terrifying efficiency. The same institutions that had enabled the trials, the church, the courts, the government, now collaborated to erase accountability. Governor Phipps's order terminating the special court in October 1692 carefully avoided admitting error, instead citing procedural concerns about spectral evidence. This bureaucratic language created plausible deniability, allowing participants to tell themselves they hadn't participated in murder but had merely followed flawed legal protocols. Modern conflict resolution experts would recognize this as ontological thawing, the gradual softening of official narratives to permit face-saving retreat from entrenched positions without explicit surrender. The financial aftermath proved particularly grotesque. While some confiscated properties were quietly returned, many families like the Englishes never recovered their full estates. Sheriff George Corwin, who had grown wealthy seizing victims' assets, died suddenly in 1696, leading his widow to bribe the nurses with £50 to avoid lawsuits. This financial hush money symbolized the community's preferred resolution, economic reparations without moral reckoning. The pattern repeats in modern settlements where payments substitute for accountability, from Japanese-American internment reparations to church abuse scandal payouts. The psychological toll on accusers emerged slowly but devastatingly. And Putnam Jr., whose testimony had helped condemn 25 people, experienced what modern clinicians would diagnose as delayed-onset PTSD. Her 1706 church confession, the only formal apology from any accuser, described being deluded by Satan, in language so carefully crafted it transferred blame from herself to supernatural forces. Even in contrition, the Puritan reflex to externalize responsibility persisted. Other afflicted girls like Mercy Lewis disappeared from records, likely ostracized by a community that found their continued presence an uncomfortable reminder. The accused who survived faced lingering stigma. Tituba's eventual fate remains mysterious. Some accounts suggest her enslaver Samuel Parris sold her after reimbursing her jail fees, a transaction that epitomized the trial's moral bankruptcy. Others, like Elizabeth Proctor, whose execution was delayed by pregnancy, lived under permanent suspicion. When her son petitioned to restore family property in 1710, neighbors still whispered about witch blood. This social contamination effect mirrors how modern exonerees struggle with invisible stigma even after legal vindication. The clergy's response demonstrated institutional self-preservation at its most cynical. Cotton Mather initially doubled down in his 1693 book, Wonders of the Invisible World, framing the trials as necessary battles against supernatural evil. Only when public opinion shifted decisively did he begin reframing his role, claiming he had actually tried to restrain the excesses. This two-stage response, defensiveness followed by selective memory, predictably recurs in modern institutional scandals, from Catholic Church abuse cover-ups to corporate malfeasance. The legal reckoning was deliberately incomplete. The 1711 reversal of attainders for 22 victims came with neither compensation nor genuine apology. The legislation carefully avoided nullifying the court's authority, instead stating the accused may be hereafter accounted as dead in law. This legalistic hair-splitting allowed the Commonwealth to sidestep admitting the trials were fundamentally unjust rather than merely procedurally flawed. The same distinction plagues modern wrongful conviction remedies that focus on technicalities rather than systemic critique. Generational transmission of trauma followed documented patterns. Descendants of the accused reported family stories of midnight burials to avoid graveyard desecration, of coded warnings never to speak of the past. The nurses became staunch advocates for due process. Their descendant Rebecca Nurse Homestead today houses New England's premier witch trial education center. Meanwhile, Putnam descendants changed their name or left the area entirely, their family legacy too heavy to bear. Modern genocide studies show similar patterns in Holocaust survivor families, where some dedicate lives to remembrance, while others flee their history. The physical landscape still bears silent witness. The execution site at Gallows Hill was deliberately forgotten, its exact location disputed until 2016 archaeological confirmation. Proctor's Ledge, where the hangings occurred, was known locally as Witch's Hollow, but absent from official maps until 2017 memorialization. This geographic repression mirrors how concentration campsites were repurposed post-World War II, or how Tulsa's Black Wall Street massacre was erased from city records. The scholarly reception proves equally revealing. Early 19th century accounts like Charles Upham's 1867 history framed the trials as an aberration, a delusion, that afflicted simple Puritans. This comforting narrative allowed descendants to distance themselves from ancestors' actions. Only in the 20th century did historians like Paul Boyer and Stephen Nissenbaum uncover the economic and social tensions underlying the accusations, forcing society to confront the trials as systemic rather than supernatural phenomena. This shift from mystical to structural explanations characterizes how modern societies process historical atrocities, from slavery to indigenous genocide. Modern reparative justice efforts reveal lingering wounds. In 1992, the Massachusetts House passed a resolution clearing and Pudney, a nurse family ancestor accused but never tried. In 2001, Governor Jane Swift signed a bill exonerating the remaining 5 unnamed victims. These belated gestures, while commendable, highlight how legal systems struggle to remedy wrongs that defy procedural fixes, like post-apartheid truth commissions or Japanese-American redress. They demonstrate both the necessity and insufficiency of bureaucratic solutions to moral injuries. Cultural representations trace society's evolving relationship to the trauma. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, 1953, used Salem as McCarthyism allegory, while contemporary shows like Salem, 2014 to 2017, blend horror tropes with feminist reinterpretations. Each generation projects its anxieties onto the trials, transforming them into Rorschach tests for current concerns, whether Red Scares, gender politics, or post-9/11 panic. This repurposing illustrates historian Michel Rolfe Trolliot's concept of historical bundles, how past events accumulate new meanings while retaining original trauma. Neuroscience now explains the intergenerational effects observed in Salem descendants. Epigenetic research shows trauma can alter gene expression for multiple generations, while neuropsychological studies demonstrate how suppressed family secrets manifest as anxiety or depression in descendants. The nurse's advocacy and Putnam's silence represent adaptive responses to this inherited trauma, one family metabolizing pain through activism, another through avoidance. The trial's most enduring legacy may be their cautionary value. Modern legal systems have internalized Salem's lessons through procedural safeguards, presumption of innocence, right to counsel, rules against hearsay evidence. Yet as wrongful convictions persist and new witch hunts emerge, whether targeting Muslims post-9/11 or scientists in climate change debates, we're reminded that procedural fixes alone can't prevent moral panics. Salem's ultimate paradox is that its very notoriety as America's premier moral catastrophe ensures its lessons remain accessible. Unlike forgotten atrocities, Salem's story is retold in every high school history class, ensuring new generations encounter its warnings. This cultural memory, imperfect but persistent, offers fragile hope that by remembering how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil, we might recognize similar patterns unfolding in our own time. The trials didn't end in 1693 or 1711 or even 2001. They entered our collective consciousness as a perpetual warning. In an era of fake news, algorithmic outrage, and resurgent authoritarianism, Salem's value lies not in its antiquity, but in its immediacy. It reminds us that the distance between civilized society and collective barbarity isn't measured in years, but in choices, and those choices are before us every day. The Salem Witch Trials have transcended their 17th century origins to become one of history's most potent cautionary tales. not because they represent some primitive aberration, but precisely because they reveal enduring patterns of human behavior that continue to manifest in modern guises. What makes Salem perpetually relevant isn't the archaic language of specters and devil's marks, but the universal psychological and social dynamics that enabled ordinary people to participate in extraordinary injustice. When we examine contemporary society through Salem's lens, the parallels become both unmistakable and unsettling, demonstrating how the same cognitive traps that fueled the witch hunts now drive everything from social media mobs to political purges. The first and most obvious modern parallel lies in the mechanics of accusation. Salem's spectral evidence, testimony about invisible attacks only the accuser could perceive, finds its digital age equivalent in the nebulous but devastating charges of toxic energy or microaggressions that circulate online. Just as the afflicted girl's unverifiable claims destroyed lives in 1692, today's viral allegations often rely on subjective interpretations of tone or body language that defy concrete proof. The #MeToo movement's legitimate revelations of abuse have been accompanied by cases where due process was abandoned in favor of spectral light, believe all victims absolutism, echoing Salem's presumption that accusations alone constituted evidence. Modern cancel culture operates on nearly identical psychological principles as the witch trials. The same three-phase progression repeats. First, an accusation, often over nuanced or decontextualized statements. Second, social media convulsions mimicking the afflicted girl's performative outrage. Third, institutional punishment ranging from job loss to public shaming. Like Salem's magistrates who accepted spectral evidence because it aligned with prevailing fears, today's HR departments and university administrators often validate dubious claims because they reflect current ideological orthodoxies. The case of Justine Sacco, whose career was destroyed by a misconstrued AIDS joke tweet, demonstrates how digital witch hunts can achieve Salem-level devastation in mere hours rather than months. The economic incentives underlying modern accusations mirror Salem's property confiscations. While 17th-century sheriffs profited directly from seized estates, today's outrage economy monetizes condemnation through click-driven media and viral fundraising campaigns. Figures like James O'Keefe have built entire careers on selectively edited sting operations that functionally serve as witch-finding enterprises, while Patreon campaigns often reward those who most skillfully perform victimhood, just as Salem's afflicted girls gain status through their accusations. Political witch hunts have evolved similar patterns. McCarthyism's mid-20th century communist purges explicitly modeled itself on Salem, complete with unprovable accusations, being soft on communism, and coerced naming of accomplices. Today's congressional hearings on tech executives or university presidents increasingly resemble spectral evidence displays, where politicians demand confession of thought crimes rather than concrete wrongdoing. The 2017 #resistance hashtags escalation from opposing Trump policies to purging complicit celebrities like Taylor Swift demonstrates how modern political movements retain Salem's binary purity tests. Corporate environments have developed their own witch trial protocols. Diversity trainings now feature privilege walks that echo Salem's public humiliation rituals, while listening sessions compel confession of unconscious biases much like magistrates' demanded admissions of supernatural temptation. The 2018 Google memo controversy, where engineer James Damore was fired for citing evolutionary psychology, showed how tech companies enforce ideological conformity through the same combination of peer pressure and institutional sanction that characterized Puritan Salem. Even modern medicine isn't immune. The rapid diagnostic expansion of conditions like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, while often legitimate, sometimes functions as Salem's witch's mark did, providing scientific-sounding explanations for behaviors that deviate from social norms. The opioid crisis saw doctors playing the role of witch finders, overprescribing painkillers to treat subjective pain reports much like Salem's physicians diagnosed supernatural affliction. The legal system continues wrestling with Salem's legacy. The 1980s 90s satanic ritual abuse panic saw hundreds wrongly convicted based on recovered memory therapy, a psychological technique as dubious as spectral evidence. Modern restraining orders sometimes operate on better safe than sorry logic, strikingly similar to Salem's preventive detention of accused witches. Even the presumption of innocence has eroded in campus sexual assault tribunals that adopt preponderance of evidence standards, a statistical approach that could have justified hanging Rebecca Nurse given 51% likelihood of guilt. Social media has exponentially amplified Salem's dynamics while removing geographical constraints. Twitter storms demonstrate virtual possession phenomena where users experience collective outrage as involuntary compulsion, the digital equivalent of the afflicted girl's convulsions. Algorithmic amplification creates self-reinforcing accusation loops that Puritan ministers could only dream of, with platforms profiting from engagement regardless of truth. The 2013 Boston Marathon online witch hunt, where Reddit users misidentified innocent suspects, showed how digital crowds can reach Salem-level hysteria in hours rather than months. Psychological research confirms these parallels. Studies of mass psychogenic illness document Salem-like symptom transmission in modern workplaces and schools. Stanford's social media toxicity research identifies moral grandstanding patterns nearly identical to the performative piety of Salem's accusers. Neuroscientists find that the brain processes social exclusion with the same intensity as physical pain, explaining why ostracism threats could compel 17th century conformity and why modern cancellation provokes such terror. The most disturbing parallel lies in how modern institutions, like Salem's theocracy, claim benevolent intentions while enabling persecution. University safe spaces morph into speech policing enclaves, much like Puritan meeting houses became accusation theaters. Corporate DI initiatives, while addressing real inequities, sometimes degenerate into Salem-style purity tests where employees must demonstrate ideological conformity through performative self-flagellation. Even public health measures during COVID-19 saw social distancing weaponized to shame dissenters in ways recalling how Salem used church attendance records to identify suspects. Salem's ultimate lesson is that the witch hunt isn't an historical artifact, but a recurring social algorithm, a set of steps that, when conditions align, reliably produce persecution. The formula remains consistent across centuries. Identify an existential threat, Satan/communism/racism. Lower evidentiary standards, spectral evidence/lived experience. Reward accusation, property confiscation/viral fame. Punish skepticism, excommunication/deplatforming. Escalate commitments, hangings/mandatory trainings. What varies are only the labels and technologies. Where Puritans used sermons and warrants, we employ tweets and HR policies. But the underlying behavioral code remains eerily similar. This isn't to equate all modern social justice efforts with witch hunts, any more than all Puritan theology led to hangings. But Salem's value lies in revealing the universal triggers that can corrupt even noble intentions: fear of the other, desire for certainty, and the human tendency to enforce conformity through coercion rather than persuasion. The trials remind us that progress isn't linear, that each generation must relearn the dangers of sacrificing due process to moral panic. In an age of deep fakes and algorithmic radicalization, Salem's warning grows more urgent. The distance between civilization and barbarity isn't measured in years, but in our willingness to recognize witch hunt patterns as they emerge in new contexts. The true horror isn't that Salem happened in 1692. It's that the psychological and social architectures that built Salem's gallows are being reconstructed daily in our courtrooms, campuses, and Twitter feeds, with bricks of good intentions and mortar of unexamined fear. Until we acknowledge these blueprints in ourselves, we remain one crisis away from becoming the next generation's cautionary tale. As we stand in the shadow of Salem's gallows more than 3 centuries later, The echoes of those dark days reverberate through our courtrooms, social media feeds, and political arenas with unnerving clarity. The Salem Witch Trials were not merely a historical tragedy confined to the age of Puritan zealotry. They were a chillingly precise blueprint for how societies unravel when fear overrides reason, when accusations replace evidence, and when institutions designed to protect instead become instruments of persecution. This is why Salem still matters, not as an antique curiosity, but as a mirror reflecting the darkest potentials of human nature that persist within us all. The enduring power of the Salem narrative lies in its universality. Every generation discovers its own witches to burn, whether they be communists during the Red Scare, suspected terrorists post 9/11, or ideological heretics in today's culture wars. The labels change, but the psychological machinery remains distressingly familiar. The same rush to judgment, the same suspension of skepticism, the same intoxicating allure of moral certainty that makes ordinary people willing executioners. What makes Salem uniquely instructive is how it lays bare the step-by-step social alchemy that transforms neighbor into informant, doubt into treason, and prejudice into policy. Modern neuroscience and behavioral psychology now confirm what Salem demonstrated empirically, that our moral compasses are more malleable than we dare admit. Studies of cognitive dissonance show how easily people rationalize harmful actions when authorities sanction them. Research on groupthink reveals how quickly dissent evaporates under social pressure. Brain imaging demonstrates that the neural circuits activated when Puritans saw spectral evidence are the same ones firing during modern moral panics. We are not so different from those 17th century farmers. We simply wear different clothes and wield smartphones instead of pitchforks. The trials also teach us about the fragility of institutional safeguards. Salem's descent into madness wasn't caused by the absence of legal protections. English common law actually contained robust evidentiary standards. The catastrophe occurred because those standards were deliberately set aside by people who believed the emergency justified extraordinary measures. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Alien and Sedition Acts, Japanese internment camps, McCarthy's blacklists, all instances where protections were suspended just this once during perceived crises. Today's debates over privacy versus security, free speech versus safety, continue this dangerous tradition of trading liberties for the illusion of protection. Yet Salem's legacy isn't entirely bleak. The same historical episode that showcases humanity's capacity for cruelty also demonstrates our ability to course correct. The eventual repudiation of the trials, however belated and incomplete, shows that societies can recover from collective madness. The descendants of both accusers and accused have worked to memorialize the victims and extract lessons from the tragedy. This imperfect but ongoing reckoning offers a template for how modern societies might address their own historical injustices, not through erasure or self-flagellation, but through clear-eyed remembrance that honors the victims while illuminating the systemic failures that victimized them. The trials also birthed unexpected positive consequences that shaped modern America. The backlash against spectral evidence influenced the evidentiary standards enshrined in the Constitution. The overreach of church power in Salem accelerated the movement towards separation of church and state. Even the concept of innocent until proven guilty gained new urgency from Salem's wrongful executions. These hard-won lessons became part of America's institutional DNA, showing how societies can metabolize trauma into progress if they have the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Our relationship to Salem continues evolving in revealing ways. Recent scholarship emphasizes the roles of race, gender, and class that earlier histories minimized. Archaeological discoveries like the 2016 identification of the execution site force physical confrontation with the past. Contemporary artists and writers increasingly center marginalized perspectives. Tituba's story, long relegated to footnotes, now inspires novels and plays that challenge traditional narratives. This ongoing reinterpretation demonstrates that history isn't static. It's a conversation where each generation must grapple anew with difficult truths. The most profound lesson Salem offers may be about the nature of evil itself. What happened in 1692 wasn't the work of mustache-twirling villains, but of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, mothers, who made small compromises that collectively enabled atrocity. This banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt termed it, remains the greatest threat to justice in any era. The real witches of Salem weren't supernatural beings. They were the very human weaknesses we all share: the capacity for prejudice, the urge to conform, the willingness to believe the worst when frightened. As we navigate our own turbulent times, with climate crises, political polarization, and technological disruptions reshaping society, Salem's specters still walk among us. They whisper in the viral outrage mobs that demand instant judgment without due process. They linger in the politicians who exploit fears for personal gain. They haunt the algorithms that profit from our most paranoid impulses. The difference is that today, we have Salem's example to warn us, if we choose to heed it. The witch trials didn't end because people became more enlightened. They ended because enough individuals finally found the courage to say no more, to stand against the tide of collective hysteria. This remains our challenge today, to recognize witch hunt dynamics in their modern guises, to resist the seductive simplicity of scapegoating, and to defend the procedural safeguards that protect us all from becoming either accuser or accused in someone else's moral panic. In the end, Salem's true legacy isn't in its court records or memorials, but in the fundamental question it forces each generation to confront. When the next wave of fear comes, as it surely will we be the ones pointing fingers or the ones speaking up for justice? The answer determines whether Salem remains merely history's warning or becomes our future's prophecy.